The Conquest of Bread. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anchor. The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Preface. One of the current objections to communism and socialism altogether is that the idea is so old and yet it has never been realized. Schemes of ideal states haunted the thinkers of ancient Greece. Later on, the early Christians joined in communist groups. Centuries later, large communist brotherhoods came into existence during the Reform movement. Then the same ideas were revived during the Great English and French Revolutions, and finally, quite lately in 1848, a revolution inspired to a great extent with socialist ideals took place in France, and yet we are told, how far away is still the realization of those schemes? Don't you think that there is some fundamental error in your understanding of human nature and its needs? At first sight, this objection seems very serious. However, the moment we consider human history more attentively, it loses its strength. We see first that hundreds of millions of men have succeeded in maintaining amongst themselves, in their village communities, for many hundreds of years, one of the main elements of socialism, the common ownership of a chief instrument of production, the land and the apportionment of the same according to the labor capacities of the different families. And we learn that if the communal possession of the land has been destroyed in Western Europe, it was not from within, but from without, by the governments which created a land monopoly in favor of the nobility and the middle classes. We learn moreover that the medieval cities succeeded in maintaining in their midst, for several centuries in succession, a certain socialized organization of production and trade, that these centuries were periods of a rapid intellectual, industrial and artistic progress, while the decay of these communal institutions came mainly from the incapacity of men of combining the village with the city, the peasant with the citizen, so as jointly to oppose the growth of the military states, which destroyed the free cities. The history of mankind, thus understood, does not offer then an argument against communism. It appears on the contrary as a succession of endeavors to realize some sort of communist organization, endeavors which were crowned here and there with a partial success of a certain duration. And all we are authorized to conclude is that mankind has not yet found the proper form for combining, on communistic principles, agriculture with a suddenly developed industry and a rapidly growing international trade. The latter appears especially as a disturbing element, since it is no longer individuals only or cities that enrich themselves by decent commerce and export, but whole nations grow rich at the cost of those nations which lag behind in their industrial development. These conditions, which began to appear by the end of the 18th century, took however their full development in the 19th century, only after the Napoleonic Wars came to an end, and modern communism has to take them into account. It is now known the French Revolution, apart from its political significance, was an attempt made by the French people in 1793 and 1794 in three different directions more or less akin to socialism. It was first the equalization of fortunes by means of an income tax and succession duties, both heavily progressive, as also by a direct confiscation of the land in order to subdivide it, and by heavy war taxes levied upon the rich only. The second attempt was a sort of municipal communism as regards the consumption of some objects of first necessity, bought by the municipalities and sold by them at cost price. And the third attempt was to introduce a wide national system of rationally established prices of all commodities, for which the real cost of production and moderate trade profit had to be taken into account. The convention worked hard at this scheme, and had nearly completed its work when reaction took the upper hand. It was during this remarkable movement, which has never yet been properly studied, that modern socialism was born. Fourierism with Lange at Lyon, and authoritarian communism with Buonarroti, Babeuf and their comrades. And it was immediately after the Great Revolution that the three great theoretical founders of modern socialism, Fourier, Saint-Simon and Robert Owen, as well as Godwin (the no-state socialism), came forward, while the secret communist societies, originated from those of Buonarroti and Babeuf, gave their stamp to militant authoritarian communism for the next 50 years. To be correct then, we must say that modern socialism is not yet 100 years old, and that for the first half of these 100 years, two nations only, which stood at the head of the industrial movement, that is Britain and France, took part in its elaboration, both bleeding at that time from the terrible wounds inflicted upon them by 15 years of Napoleonic wars, and both enveloped in the great European reaction that had come from the East. In fact, it was only after the Revolution of July 1830 in France and the Reform movement of 1830 to 1832 in this country had begun to shake off that terrible reaction that the discussion of socialism became possible for a few years before the Revolution of 1848, and it was during those years that the aspirations of Fourier, Saint-Simon and Robert Owen, worked out by their followers, took a definite shape, and the different schools of socialism which exist nowadays were defined. In Britain, Robert Owen and his followers worked out the schemes of communist villages, agricultural and industrial at the same time. Immense cooperative associations were started for creating with their dividends more communist colonies, and the great consolidated trade union was founded, the forerunner of both the labor parties of our days and the International Working Men's Association.
In France, the Fourierist considerant issued his remarkable manifesto, which contains beautifully developed all the theoretical considerations upon the growth of capitalism, which are now described as scientific socialism. Proudhon worked out his idea of anarchism and mutualism without state interference. Louis Blanc published his Organization of Labour, which became later on the program of Lassalle. Vidal in France and Lorenz Stein in Germany further developed into remarkable works published in 1846 and 1847 respectively, the theoretical conceptions of considerant, and finally Vidal, and especially Picquet, developed in detail the system of collectivism, which the former wanted the National Assembly of 1848 to vote in the shape of laws. However, there is one feature common to all socialist schemes of that period which must be noted. The three great founders of socialism who wrote at the dawn of the 19th century were so entranced by the wide horizon which it opened before them, that they looked upon it as a new revelation, and upon themselves as upon the founders of a new religion. Socialism had to be a religion, and they had to regulate its march, as the heads of a new church. Besides, writing during the period of reaction which had followed the French Revolution, and seeing more its failures than its successors, they did not trust the masses, and they did not appeal to them for bringing about the changes which they thought necessary. They put their faith, on the contrary, into some great ruler, some socialist Napoleon. He would understand the new revelation, he would be convinced of its desirability by the successful experiments of their phalansteries or associations, and he would peacefully accomplish by his own authority the revolution which would bring well-being and happiness to mankind. A military genius, Napoleon had just been ruling Europe. Why should not a social genius come forward, carry Europe with him, and translate the new gospel into life? That faith was rooted very deep, and it stood for a long time in the way of socialism. Its traces are even seen among us, down to the present day. It was only during the years 1840 to 48, when the approach of a revolution was felt everywhere, and the proletarians were beginning to plant the banner of socialism on the barricades, that faith in the people began to enter once more the hearts of the social schemers. Faith on the one side in republican democracy, and on the other side in free association, in the organizing powers of the working men themselves. But then came the revolution of February 1848, the middle-class republic, and with it shattered hopes. 4 months only after the proclamation of the Republic, the June insurrection of the Paris proletarians broke out, and it was crushed in blood. The wholesale shooting of the working men, the mass deportations to New Guinea, and finally the Napoleonian coup d'etat followed. The socialists were persecuted with fury, and the weeding out was so terrible and so thorough that for the next 12 or 15 years the very traces of socialism disappeared. Its literature vanished so completely that even names once so familiar before 1848 were entirely forgotten. Ideas which were then current, the stock ideas of the socialists before 1848, were so wiped out as to be taken later on by our generation for new discoveries. However, when a new revival began, about 1866, when communism and collectivism once more came forward, it appeared that the conception as to the means of their realization had undergone a deep change. The old faith in political democracy was dying out, and the first principles upon which the Paris working men agreed with the British trade unionists and Owenites when they met in 1862 and 1864 at London was that the emancipation of the working men must be accomplished by the working men themselves. Upon another point, they also were agreed. It was that the labor unions themselves would have to get hold of the instruments of production and organize production themselves. The French idea of the Fourierist and Mutualist Association thus joined hands with Robert Owen's idea of a great consolidated trades union, which was extended down so as to become an international working men's association. Again, this new revival of socialism lasted but a few years. Soon came the war of 1870–71, the uprising of the Paris Commune, and again the free development of socialism was rendered impossible in France. But while Germany accepted now from the hands of its German teachers, Marx and Engels, the socialism of the French 48ers, that is, the socialism of Considérant and Louis Blanc, and the collectivism of Picquet, France made a further step forward. In March 1871, Paris had proclaimed that henceforward it would not wait for the retardatory portions of France, that it intended to start within its commune its own social development. The movement was too short-lived to give any positive result. It remained communalist only. It merely asserted the rights of the commune to its full autonomy. But the working classes of the whole International saw at once its historical significance. They understood that the free commune would be henceforth the medium in which the ideas of modern socialism may come to realization. The free agro-industrial communes, of which so much was spoken in England and France before 1848, need not be small phalansteries or small communities of 2,000 persons. They must be vast agglomerations like Paris, or still better small territories. These communes would federate to constitute nations in some cases, even irrespectively of the present national frontiers (open bracket) like the Cinque Ports or the Hansa (close bracket). At the same time, large labour associations would come into existence for the intercommunal service of the railways, the docks, and so on. Such were the ideas which began vaguely to circulate after 1871 amongst the thinking working men, especially in the Latin countries. In some such organization, the details of which life itself would settle, the labour circles saw the medium through which socialist forms of life would find a much easier realization than through the seizure of all industrial property by the state, and the state organization of agriculture and industry. These are the ideas to which I have endeavored to give a more or less definite expression in this book. Looking back now at the years that have passed since this book was written, I can say in full conscience that its leading ideas must have been correct. State socialism has certainly made considerable progress. State railways, state banking, and state trade in spirits have been introduced here and there, but every step made in this direction, even though it resulted in the cheapening of a given community, was found to be a mere obstacle in the struggle of the working men for their emancipation. So that we find growing amongst the working men, especially in Western Europe, the idea that even the working of such a vast national property as a railway net would be much better handled by a federated union of railway employees than by a state organization. On the other side, we see that countless attempts have been made all over Europe and America, the leading idea of which is on the one side to get into the hands of the working men themselves wide branches of production, and on the other side to always widen in the cities the circles of the functions which the city performs in the interest of its inhabitants. Trade unionism, with a growing tendency towards organizing the different trades internationally and of being not only an instrument for the improvement of the conditions of labor, but also of becoming an organization which might at a given moment take into its hands the management of production, cooperation both for production and for distribution, both in industry and agriculture, and attempts at combining both sorts of cooperation in experimental colonies, and finally the immensely varied field of the so-called municipal socialism. These are the three directions in which the greatest amount of creative power has been developed lately. Of course, none of these may in any degree be taken as a substitute for communism, or even for socialism, both of which imply the common possession of the instruments of production, but we certainly must look at all these attempts as upon experiments, like those which Owen, Fourier and Saint-Simon tried in their colonies, experiments which prepare human thought to conceive some of the practical forms in which a communist society might find its expression. The synthesis of all these partial experiments will have to be made someday by the constructive genius of some one of the civilized nations, but samples of the bricks out of which the great synthetic building will have to be built, and even samples of some of its rooms, are being prepared by the immense effort of the constructive genius of man. Brighton, January 1913. End of preface. Recording by Enko. So bread. This is a LibraryVox recording. All LibraryVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit libraryvox.org. Recording by Enko. The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Our Riches. Part 1. The human race has travelled a long way since those remote ages when men fashioned their rude implements of flint and lived on the precarious spoils of hunting, leaving to their children for their only heritage a shelter beneath the rocks, some poor utensils, and nature, vast, unknown and terrific, with whom they had to fight for their wretched existence. During the long succession of agitated ages which have elapsed since, mankind has nevertheless amassed untold treasures. It has cleared the land, dried the marshes, hewn down forests, made roads, pierced mountains. It has been building, inventing, observing, reasoning. It has created a complex machinery, wrested her secrets from nature, and finally it pressed steam and electricity into its service. And the result is that now the child of the civilized man finds at its birth, ready for its use, an immense capital accumulated by those who have gone before him, and this capital enables man to acquire, merely by his own labor, combined with the labor of others, riches surpassing the dreams of the fairy tales of 1,001 nights. The soil is cleared to a great extent, fit for the reception of the best seeds, ready to give a rich return for the skill and labor spent upon it, a return more than sufficient for all the wants of humanity. The methods of rational cultivation are known. On the wide prairies of America, each 100 men, with the aid of powerful machinery, can produce in a few months enough wheat to maintain 10,000 people for a whole year. And where man wishes to double his produce, to treble it, to multiply it 100-fold, he makes the soil, gives to each plant the requisite care, and thus obtains enormous returns. While the hunter of old had to scour 15 or 60 square miles to find food for his family, the civilized man supports his household with far less pains and far more certainty on 1,000 parts of that space. Climate is no longer an obstacle. When the sun fails, man replaces it by artificial heat, and we see the coming of a time when artificial light also will be used to stimulate vegetation. Meanwhile, by the use of glass and hot water pipes, man renders a given space 10 and 50 times more productive than it was in its natural state. The prodigies accomplished in industry are still more striking. With the cooperation of those intelligent beings, modern machines, themselves the fruit of 3 or 4 generations of inventors, mostly unknown, 100 men manufacture now the stuff to provide 10,000 persons with clothing for 2 years. In well-managed coal mines, the labor of 100 miners furnishes each year enough fuel to warm 10,000 families under an inclement sky, and we have lately witnessed the spectacle of wonderful cities springing up in a few months for international exhibitions, without interrupting in the slightest degree the regular work of the nations. And if in manufactures as in agriculture, and as indeed through our whole social system, the labor, the discoveries, and the inventions of our ancestors profit chiefly the few, it is none the less certain that mankind in general, aided by the creatures of steel and iron which it already possesses, could already procure an existence of wealth and ease for every one of its members. Truly we are rich, far richer than we think, rich in what we already possess, richer still in the possibilities of production of our actual mechanical outfit, richest of all in what we might win from our soil, from our manufactures, from our science, from our technical knowledge, were they but applied to bringing about the well-being of all. Part 2. In our civilized societies we are rich. Why then are the many poor? Why this painful drudgery for the masses? Why even to the best paid workmen, this uncertainty for the morrow, in the midst of all the wealth inherited from the past, and in spite of the powerful means of production, which could ensure comfort to all, in return for a few hours of daily toil? The Socialists have said it and repeated it unwearyingly. Daily they reiterate it, demonstrating it by arguments taken from all the sciences. It is because all that is necessary for production, the land, the mines, the highways, machinery, food, shelter, education, knowledge, all have been seized by the few in the course of that long story of robbery, enforced migration and wars, of ignorance and oppression, which has been the life of the human race before it had learned to subdue the forces of nature. It is because, taking advantage of alleged rights acquired in the past, these few appropriate today 2/3 of the products of human labor, and then squander them in the most stupid and shameful way. It is because, having reduced the masses to a point at which they have not the means of subsistence for a month, or even for a week in advance, the few can allow the many to work, only on the condition of themselves receiving the lion's share. It is because these few prevent the remainder of men from producing the things they need, and force them to produce, not the necessaries of life for all, but whatever offers the greatest profits to the monopolists. In this is the substance of all socialism. Take indeed a civilized country. The forests which once covered it have been cleared, the marshes drained, the climate improved, it has been made habitable. The soil which bore formerly only a coarse vegetation is covered today with rich harvests. The rock walls in the valleys are laid out in terraces and covered with vines. The wild plants, which yielded naught but acrid berries or uneatable roots, have been transformed by generations of culture into succulent vegetables or trees covered with delicious fruits. Thousands of highways and railroads furrow the earth and pierce the mountains. The shriek of the engine is heard in the wild gorges of the Alps, the Caucasus, and the Himalayas. The rivers have been made navigable, the coasts carefully surveyed are easy of access, Artificial harbours, laboriously dug out and protected against the fury of the sea, afford shelter to the ships. Deep shafts have been sunk in the rocks. Labyrinths of underground galleries have been dug out where coal may be raised or minerals extracted. At the crossings of the highways, great cities have sprung up, and within their borders all the treasures of industry, science, and art have been accumulated. Whole generations that lived and died in misery, oppressed and ill-treated by their masters, and worn out by toil, have handed on this immense inheritance to our century. For thousands of years, millions of men have labored to clear the forests, to drain the marshes, and to open up highways by land and water. Every rood of soil we cultivate in Europe has been watered by the sweat of several races of men. Every acre has its story of enforced labor, of intolerable toil, of the people's sufferings. Every mile of railway, every yard of tunnel has received its share of human blood. The shafts of the mine still bear on the rocky walls the marks made by the pick of the workmen who toiled to excavate them. The space between each prop in the underground galleries might be marked as a miner's grave, and who can tell what each of these graves has cost, in tears, in privations, in unspeakable wretchedness, to the family who depended on the scanty wage of the worker cut off in his prime by fire damp, rockfall, or flood. The cities, bound together by railroads and waterways, are organisms which have lived through centuries. Dig beneath them, and you find, one above another, the foundations of streets, of houses, of theatres, of public buildings. Search into their history, and you will see how the civilization of a town, its industry, its special characteristics, have slowly grown and ripened through the cooperation of generations of its inhabitants before it could become what it is today. And even today, the value of each dwelling, factory and warehouse, which has been created by the accumulated labour of the millions of workers, now dead and buried, is only maintained by the very presence and labour of legions of the men who now inhabit that special corner of the globe. Each of the atoms composing what we call the wealth of nations owes its value to the fact that it is a part of a great whole. What would a London dockyard or a great Paris warehouse be if they were not situated in these great centres of international commerce? What would become of our mines, our factories, our workshops, and our railways, without the immense quantities of merchandise transported every day by sea and land? Millions of human beings have labored to create this civilization on which we pride ourselves today. Other millions, scattered through the globe, labor to maintain it. Without them, nothing would be left in 50 years but ruins. There is not even a thought or an invention which is not common property, born of the past and the present. Thousands of inventors, known and unknown, who have died in poverty, have cooperated in the invention of each of these machines, which embody the genius of man. Thousands of writers, of poets, of scholars, have labored to increase knowledge, to dissipate error, and to create that atmosphere of scientific thought without which the marvels of our century could never have appeared. And these thousands of philosophers, of poets, of scholars, of inventors, have themselves been supported by the labour of past centuries. They have been upheld and nourished through life, both physically and mentally, by legions of workers and craftsmen of all sorts. They have drawn their motive force from the environment. The genius of a Segar, a Mayer, a Grove, has certainly done more to launch industry in new directions than all the capitalists in the world, but men of genius are themselves the children of industry as well as of science. Not until thousands of steam engines had been working for years before all eyes, constantly transforming heat into dynamic force, and this force into sound, light and electricity, could the inside of genius proclaim the mechanical origin and the unity of the physical forces. And if we, children of the 19th century, have at last grasped this idea, if we now know how to apply it, it is again because daily experience has prepared the way. The thinkers of the 18th century saw and declared it, but the idea remained undeveloped because the 18th century had not grown up like ours, side by side with the steam engine. Imagine the decades that might have passed while we remain in ignorance of this law, which has revolutionized modern industry, had Watt not found at Soho skilled workmen to embody his ideas in metal, bringing all the parts of his engine to perfection, so that steam, pent in a complete mechanism, and rendered more docile than a horse, more manageable than water, became at last the very soul of modern industry. Every machine has had the same history, a long record of sleepless nights and of poverty, of disillusions and of joys, of partial improvements discovered by several generations of nameless workers, who have added to the original invention these little nothings, without which the most fertile idea would remain fruitless. More than that, every new invention is a synthesis, the resultant of innumerable inventions which have preceded it in the vast field of mechanics and industry. Science and industry, knowledge and application, discovery and practical realization leading to new discoveries, cunning of brain and of hand, toil of mind and muscle, all work together. Each discovery, each advance, each increase in the sum of human riches owes its being to the physical and mental travel of the past and the present. By what right then can anyone whatever appropriate the least morsel of his immense whole and say, "This is mine, not yours, part free"? It has come about, however, in the course of the ages traversed by the human race, that all that enables man to produce and to increase his power of production has been seized by the few. Sometime, perhaps, we will relate how this came to pass. For the present, let it suffice to say the fact and analyze its consequences. Today the soil, which actually owes its value to the needs of an ever-increasing population, belongs to a minority who prevent the people from cultivating it, or do not allow them to cultivate it according to modern methods. The mines, though they represent the labor of several generations, and derive their sole value from the requirements of the industry of a nation and the density of the population, the mines also belong to the few, and these few restrict the output of coal, or prevent it entirely if they find more profitable investments for their capital. Machinery, too, has become the exclusive property of a few, and even when a machine incontestably represents the improvements added to the original rough invention by 3 or 4 generations of workers, it nonetheless belongs to a few owners, and if the descendants of the very inventor who constructed the first machine for lace making a century ago were to present themselves today in a lace factory at Bale or Nottingham and claim their rights, they would be told, "Hands off, this machine is not yours," and they would be shut down if they attempted to take possession of it. The railways, which would be useless as so much old iron without the teeming population of Europe, its industry, its commerce and its marts, belong to a few shareholders, ignorant perhaps of the whereabouts of the lines of rails which yield them revenues greater than those of medieval kings. And if the children of those who perish by thousands, while excavating the railway cuttings and tunnels, were to assemble one day, crowding in their rags and hunger, to demand bread from the shareholders, they would be met with bayonets and grape-shot, to disperse them and safeguard vested interests. In virtue of this monstrous system, the son of the worker, on entering life, has no field which he may till, no machine which he may tend, no mine in which he may dig, without accepting to leave a great part of what he will produce to a master. He must sell his labour for a scant and uncertain wage. His father and his grandfather have toiled to drain this field, to build this mill, to perfect this machine. They gave to the work the full measure of their strength, and what more could they give? But there here comes into the world poorer than the lowest savage. If he obtains leave to till the fields, it is on condition of surrendering a quarter of the produce to his master, and another quarter to the government and the middlemen. And this tax, levied upon him by the state, the capitalist, the lord of the manor, and the middleman, is always increasing. It rarely leaves him the power to improve his system of culture. If he turns to industry, he is allowed to work, though not always even that, only on condition that he yield a half or two-thirds of the product to him whom the land recognizes as the owner of the machine. We cry shame on the feudal baron who forbade the peasant to turn a clod of earth unless he surrendered to his lord a fourth of his crop. We call those the barbarous times. But if the forms have changed, the relations have remained the same, and the worker is forced, under the name of free contract, to accept feudal obligations. For turn where he will, he can find no better conditions. Everything has become private property, and he must accept or die of hunger. The result of this state of things is that all our production tends in a wrong direction. Enterprise takes no thought for the needs of the community. Its only aim is to increase the gains of the speculator. Hence the constant fluctuations of trade, the periodical industrial crises, each of which throws scores of thousands of workers on the streets. The working people cannot purchase with their wages the wealth which they have produced, and industry seeks foreign markets among the moneyed classes of other nations. In the East, in Africa, everywhere, in Egypt, Tonkin, or the Congo, the European is thus bound to promote the growth of serfdom, and so he does. But soon he finds that everywhere there are similar competitors. All the nations evolve on the same lines, and wars, perpetual wars, break out for the right of precedence in the market. Wars for the possession of the East, wars for the empire of the sea, wars to impose duties on imports and to dictate conditions to neighboring states, wars against those blacks who revolt. The roar of the cannon never ceases in the world. Whole races are massacred. The states of Europe spend a third of their budgets in armaments, and we know how heavily these taxes fall on the workers. Education still remains the privilege of a small minority, for it is idle to talk of education when the workman's child is forced, at the age of 13, to go down into the mine or to help his father on the farm. It is idle to talk of studying to the worker who comes home in the evening, worried by excessive toil and its brutalizing atmosphere. Society is thus bound to remain divided into two hostile camps, and in such conditions, freedom is a vain word. The radical begins by demanding a greater extension of political rights, but he soon sees that the breath of liberty leads to the uplifting of the proletariat, and then he turns round, changes his opinions, and reverts to repressive legislation and government by the sword. A vast array of courts, judges, executioners, policemen, and gaolers is needed to uphold these privileges, and this array gives rise in its turn to a whole system of espionage, of false witness, of spies, of threats and corruption. The system under which we live checks in its turn the growth of the social sentiment. We all know that without uprightness, without self-respect, without sympathy and mutual aid, humankind must perish, as perish the few races of animals living by rapine, or the slave-keeping ants. But such ideas are not to the taste of the ruling classes, and they have elaborated a whole system of pseudo-science to teach the contrary. Fine sermons have been preached on the text that those who have should share with those who have not, but he who would carry out this principle would be speedily informed that these beautiful sentiments are all very well in poetry, but not in practice. To lie is to degrade and besmirch oneself, we say, and yet all civilized life becomes one huge lie. We accustom ourselves and our children to hypocrisy, to the practice of a double-faced morality, and since the brain is ill at ease among lies, we cheat ourselves with sophistry. Hypocrisy and sophistry become the second nature of a civilized man. But a society cannot live thus. It must return to truth, or cease to exist. Thus the consequences which spring from the original act of monopoly spread through the whole of social life. Under pain of death, human societies are forced to return to first principles, the means of production being the collective work of humanity. The product should be the collective property of a race. Individual appropriation is neither just nor serviceable. All belongs to all. All things are for all men, since all men have need of them, since all men have worked in the measure of their strength to produce them, and since it is not possible to evaluate everyone's part in the production of the world's wealth. All things for all. Here is an immense stock of tools and implements. Here are all those iron slaves, which we call machines, which saw and plane, spin and weave for us, and making and remaking, working up raw matter to produce the marvels of our time. But nobody has the right to seize a single one of these machines and say, "This is mine. If you want to use it, you must pay me a tax on each of your products," any more than the feudal lord of medieval times had the right to say to the peasant, "This hill, this meadow belong to me, and you must pay me a tax on every sheaf of corn you reap, on every brick you build." All is for all. If the men and the women bear their fair share of work, they have a right to their fair share of all that is produced by all, and that share is enough to secure them well-being. No more of such vague formulas as the right to work, or to each the whole result of his labor. What we proclaim is the right to well-being, well-being for all. As recording by Anchor. Conquest of Bread. This is a LibraryVox recording. All LibraryVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit libraryvox.org. Recording by Anchor. The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Well-being for all. But well-being for all is not a dream. It is possible, realizable, owing to all that our ancestors have done to increase our powers of production. We know indeed that the producers, although they constitute hardly one-third of the inhabitants of civilized countries, even now produce such quantities of goods that a certain degree of comfort could be brought to every hearth. We know further that if all those who squander today the fruits of others' toil were forced to employ their leisure in useful work, our wealth would increase in proportion to the number of producers and more. Finally, we know that contrary to the theory enunciated by Malthus, that oracle of middle-class economics, the productive powers of the human race increase at a much more rapid ratio than its powers of reproduction. The more thickly men are crowded on the soil, the more rapid is the growth of their wealth-creating power. Thus, although the population of England has only increased from 1844 to 1890 by 62%, its production has grown, even at the lowest estimate, at double that rate, to wit, by 130%. In France, where the population has grown more slowly, the increase in production is nevertheless very rapid. Notwithstanding the crisis through which agriculture is frequently passing, notwithstanding state interference, the blood tax (conscription) and speculative commerce and finance, the production of wheat in France has increased fourfold, and industrial production more than tenfold, in the course of the last 80 years. In the United States, this progress is still more striking. In spite of immigration, or rather precisely because of the influx of surplus European labor, the United States have multiplied their wealth tenfold. However, these figures give but a very faint idea of what our wealth might become under better conditions. For alongside of the rapid development of our wealth-producing powers, we have an overwhelming increase in the ranks of the idlers and middlemen. Instead of capital gradually concentrating itself in a few hands, so that it would only be necessary for the community to dispossess a few millionaires and enter upon its local heritage, instead of the socialist focus proving true, the exact reverse is coming to pass. The swarm of parasites is ever increasing. In France, there are not 10 actual producers to every 30 inhabitants. The whole agricultural wealth of the country is the work of less than 7 millions of men. And in the two great industries, mining and the textile trades, you will find that the workers number less than 2.5 millions. But the exploiters of labor, how many are they? In the United Kingdom, a little over 1 million workers, men, women and children, are employed in all the textile trades. Less than 900,000 work the mines, much less than 2 million till the ground, and it appeared from the last industrial census that only a little over 4 million men, women and children were employed in all the industries. Footnote 4,013,711 now employed in all the 53 branches of different industries, including the state ordnance works, and 241,530 workers engaged in the construction and maintenance of railways, their aggregate production reaching the value of £1,041,037,000, and the net output being £406,799,000. Close footnote. So that the statisticians have to exaggerate all the figures in order to establish a maximum of 8 million producers to 45 million inhabitants. Strictly speaking, the creators of the goods exported from Britain to all the ends of the earth comprise only from 6 to 7 million workers. And what is the number of the shareholders and middlemen who levy the first fruits of labor from far and near, and heap up unearned gains by thrusting themselves between the producer and the consumer? Nor is this all. The owners of capital constantly reduce the output by restraining production. We need not speak of the cartloads of oysters thrown into the sea to prevent a dainty, hitherto reserved for the rich, from becoming a food for the people. We need not speak of the 1,001 luxuries, stuff, goods, etc., etc., treated after the same fashion as the oysters. It is enough to remember the way in which the production of the most necessary things is limited. Legends of miners are ready and willing to dig out coal every day, and send it to those who are shivering with cold, but too often a third, or even one half, of their number are forbidden to work more than 3 days a week, because forsooth the price of coal must be kept up. Thousands of weavers are forbidden to work the looms, although their wives and children go in rags, and although 3/4 of the population of Europe have no clothing worthy the name. Hundreds of blast furnaces, thousands of factories periodically stand idle. Others only work half-time, and in every civilized nation there is a permanent population of about 2 million individuals who ask only for work, but to whom work is denied. How gladly would these millions of men set to work to reclaim wastelands, or to transform ill-cultivated land into fertile fields, rich in harvest. A year of well-directed toil would suffice to multiply fivefold the produce of those millions of acres in this country, which lie idle now as permanent pasture, or of those dry lands in the south of France, which now yield only about 8 bushels of wheat per acre. But men who would be happy to become hardy pioneers in so many branches of well-producing activity must remain idle because the owners of the soil, the mines and the factories prefer to invest their capital, taken in the first place from the community, in Turkish or Egyptian bonds or in Patagonian gold mines, and so make Egyptian fellahs Italian immigrants, and Chinese coolies, their wage slaves. This is the direct and deliberate limitation of production. But there is also a limitation indirect and not of set purpose, which consists in spending human toil on objects absolutely useless or destined only to satisfy the dull vanity of the rich. It is impossible to reckon in figures the extent to which wealth is restricted indirectly, the extent to which energy is squandered while it might have served to produce, and above all to prepare the machinery necessary to production. It is enough to cite the immense sums spent by Europe in armaments, for the sole purpose of acquiring control of markets, and so forcing her own goods on neighboring territories, and making exploitation easier at home. The millions paid every year to officials of all sorts, whose function it is to maintain the rights of minorities, the right that is of a few rich men to manipulate the economic activities of a nation, the millions spent on judges, prisons, policemen, and all the paraphernalia of so-called justice, spent to no purpose, because we know that every alleviation, however slight, of the righteousness of our great cities is always followed by a considerable diminution of crime. Lastly, the millions spent on propagating pernicious doctrines by means of the press and news cooked in the interest of this or that party, of this politician or of that group of speculators. But over and above this, we must take into account all the labor that goes to sheer waste, here in keeping up the stables, the kennels, and the retinue of the rich, there in pandering to the caprices of society and the depraved taste of the fashionable mob, there again in forcing the consumer to buy what he does not need, or foisting an inferior article upon him by means of puffery, and in producing on the other hand wares which are absolutely injurious but profitable to the manufacturer. What is squandered in this manner would be enough to double the production of useful things, also to plenish our mills and factories with machinery that they would soon flood the shops with all that is now lacking to two-thirds of the nation. Under our present system, a full quarter of the producers in every nation are forced to be idle for 3 or 4 months in the year, and the labor of another quarter, if not of a half, has no better results than the amusement of the rich or the exploitation of the public. Thus, if we consider on the one hand the rapidity with which civilized nations augment their powers of production, and on the other hand the limits set to their production, be it directly or indirectly, by existing conditions we cannot but conclude that an economic system a trifle more reasonable would permit them to heap up in a few years so many useful products that they would be constrained to say, enough, we have enough coal and bread and raiment. Let us rest and consider how best to use our powers, how best to employ our leisure. No, plenty for all is not a dream, though it was a dream indeed in those days, when man, for all his pains, could hardly win a few bushels of wheat from an acre of land, and had to fashion by hand all the implements he used in agriculture and industry. Now it is no longer a dream, because man has invented a motor which, with a little iron and a few sacks of coal, gives him the mastery of a creature strong and docile as a horse, and capable of setting the most complicated machinery in motion. But if plenty for all is to become a reality, this immense capital, cities, houses, pastures, arable lands, factories, highways, education, must cease to be regarded as private property, for the monopolist to dispose of at his pleasure. This rich endowment, painfully won, builded, fashioned, or invented by our ancestors, must become common property, so that the collective interests of men may gain from it the greatest good for all. There must be expropriation, the well-being of all, the end, expropriation, the means, or two. Expropriation, such then, is the problem which history has put before the men of the 20th century, the return to communism in all that ministers to the well-being of men. But this problem cannot be solved by means of legislation. No one imagines that. The poor as well as the rich understand that neither the existing governments, nor any which might arise out of possible political changes, would be capable of finding such a solution. They feel the necessity of a social revolution, and both rich and poor recognize that this revolution is imminent, that it may break out in a few years. A great change in thought has taken place during the last half of the 19th century, but suppressed as it was by the propertied classes and denied its natural development, this new spirit must now break its bond by violence and realize itself in a revolution. Whence will the revolution come? How will it announce its coming? No one can answer these questions. The future is hidden. But those who watch and think do not misinterpret the signs. Workers and exploiters, revolutionists and conservatives, thinkers and men of action, all feel that a revolution is at our doors. Well then, what are we going to do when the thunderbolt has fallen? We have all been bent on studying the dramatic side of revolution so much, and the practical work of revolution so little, that we are apt to see only the stage effects, so to speak, of this great movement, the fight of the first days, the barricades. But this fight, this first skirmish, is soon ended, and it only after the breakdown of the whole system that the real work of revolution can be said to begin. Effete and powerless, attack on all sides, the old rulers are soon swept away by the breath of insurrection. In a few days the middle-class monarchy of 1848 was no more, and while Louis Philippe was making good his escape in a cab, Paris had already forgotten her citizen king. The government of Thiers disappeared, on the 18th of March 1871 in a few hours, leaving Paris mistress of her destinies. Yet 1848 and 1871 were only insurrections. Before a popular revolution, the masters of the old order disappear with a surprising rapidity. Its upholders fly the country to plot in safety elsewhere and to devise measures for their return. The former government having disappeared, the army, hesitating before the tide of popular opinion, no longer obeys its commanders, who have also prudently decamped. The troops stand by without interfering, or join the rebels. The police, standing at ease, are uncertain whether to belabor the crowd or to cry "Long live the Commune," while some retire to their quarters to await the pleasure of the new government. Wealthy citizens pack their trunks and betake themselves to places of safety. The people remain. This is how a revolution is ushered in. In several large towns the Commune is proclaimed. In the streets wander scores of thousands of men, and in the evening the crowd into improvised clubs asking, "What shall we do?" and ardently discuss public affairs. All take an interest in them. Those who yesterday were quite indifferent are perhaps the most zealous. Everywhere there is plenty of goodwill and a keen desire to make victory certain. It is a time when acts of supreme devotion are occurring. The masses of the people are full of a desire of going forward. All this is splendid, sublime, but still it is not a revolution. Nay, it is only now that the work of a revolutionist begins. Doubtless there will be acts of vengeance. The Watrins and the Thomases will pay the penalty of their unpopularity. But these are mere incidents of the struggle, not the revolution. Socialist politicians, radicals, neglected geniuses of journalism, stop orators, both middle-class people and workmen, will hurry to the town hall, to the government offices, to take possession of the vacant seats. Some will decorate themselves with gold and silver laced to their heart's content, admire themselves in ministerial mirrors, and study to give orders with an air of importance appropriate to their new position. How could they impress their comrades of the office or the workshop without having a red sash, an embroidered cap, and magisterial gestures? Others will bury themselves in official papers, trying with the best of wills to make head or tail of them. They will indict laws and issue high-flown worded decrees that nobody will take the trouble to carry out, because revolution has come. To give themselves an authority which they have not, they will seek the sanction of all forms of government. They will take the names of provisional government, Committee of Public Safety, Mayor, Governor of the Town Hall, Commissioner of Public Safety, and what not. Elected or acclaimed, they will assemble in boards or in communal councils, where men of 10 or 20 different schools will come together, representing not as many private chapels, as it is often said, but as many different conceptions regarding the scope, the bearing, and the goal of a revolution. Possibilists, collectivists, radicals, Jacobins, Blanquists will be thrust together and waste time in wordy warfare. Honest men will be huddled together with the ambitious ones, whose only dream is power and who spurn the crown whence they are sprung, all coming together with diametrically opposed views, all forced to enter into ephemeral alliances in order to create majorities that can but last a day, wrangling, calling each other reactionaries, authoritarians, and rascals, incapable of coming to an understanding in any serious measure, dragged into discussions about trifles, producing nothing better than bombastic proclamations, all giving themselves an awful importance, while the real strength of a movement is in the streets. All this may please those who like the stage, but it is not revolution. Nothing has been accomplished as yet, and meanwhile the people suffer. The factories are idle, the workshops close, trade is at a standstill. The worker does not even earn the meager wage which was his before. Food goes up in price. With that heroic devotion which has always characterized them, and which in great crises reaches the sublime, the people will wait patiently. We place these 3 months of want at the service of the Republic, they said in 1848, while the representatives and the gentlemen of the new government, down to the meanest jack in office, receive their salary regularly. The people suffer. With a childlike faith, with the good humor of the masses who believe in their leaders, they think that yonder in the House, in the Town Hall, in the Committee of Public Safety, their welfare is being considered, but yonder they are discussing everything under the sun except the welfare of the people. In 1793, while famine ravaged France and crippled the revolution, whilst the people were reduced to the depths of misery, although the Champs-Élysées were lined with luxurious carriages where women displayed their jewels and splendor, Robespierre was urging the Jacobins to discuss his treaties on the English constitution. While the worker was suffering in 1848 from the general stoppage of trade, the provisional government and the National Assembly were wrangling over military pensions and prison labor, without troubling how the people managed to live during the terrible crisis. And could one coarsely reproach of the Paris Commune, which was born beneath the Prussian cannon and lasted only 70 days, it would be for this same error, this failure to understand that the revolution could not triumph unless those who fought on his side were fed, that on 15 pence a day a man cannot fight on the ramparts and at the same time support a family. The people will suffer and say, how is a way out of these difficulties to be found? Part 3. It seems to us that there is only one answer to this question. We must recognize and loudly proclaim that everyone, whatever his grade in the whole society, whether strong or weak, capable or incapable, has before everything the right to live, and that society is bound to share amongst all, without exception, the means of existence it has at its disposal. We must acknowledge this, and proclaim it aloud, and act up to it. Affairs must be managed in such a way that from the first day of the revolution, the worker shall know that a new era is opening before him, that henceforward none need crouch under the bridges, while palaces are hard by, none need fast in the midst of plenty, none need perish with cold near shops full of furs, that all is for all, in practice as well as in theory, and that at last, for the first time in history, a revolution has been accomplished which considers the needs of the people before schooling them in their duties. This cannot be brought about by acts of parliament, but only by taking immediate and effective possession of all that is necessary to ensure the well-being of all. This is the only really scientific way of going to work, the only way which can be understood and desired by the mass of the people. We must take possession in the name of the people, of the granaries, the shops full of clothing, and the dwelling houses. Nothing must be wasted. We must organize without delay a way to feed the hungry, to satisfy all wants, to meet all needs, to produce not for the special benefit of this one or that one, but so as to ensure to society as a whole its life and further development. Enough of ambiguous words like the right to work, with which the people were misled in 1848, and which are still resorted to with the hope of misleading them. Let us have the courage to recognize that well-being for all, henceforward possible, must be realized. When the workers claimed the right to work in 1848, national and municipal workshops were organized, and workmen were sent to drudge there at the rate of 1s. 8d a day. When they asked the organization of labor, the reply was, patience, friends, the government will see to it. Meantime, here is your 1s8d. Rest now, brave toiler, after your lifelong struggle for food. And in the meantime, the cannons were overhauled, the reserves called out, and the workers themselves disorganized by the many methods well known to the middle classes, till one fine day, in June 1848, 4 months after the overthrow of the previous government, they were told to go and colonize Africa, or be shut down. Very different will be the result if the workers claim the right to well-being. In claiming that right, they claim the right to take possession of the wealth of the community, to take houses to dwell in according to the needs of each family, to socialize the stores of food and learn the meaning of plenty, after having known famine too well. They proclaim their right to all social wealth, fruit of the labor of past and present generations, and learn by its means to enjoy those higher pleasures of art and science which have too long been monopolized by the rich. And while asserting their right to live in comfort, they assert what is still more important, their right to decide for themselves what this comfort shall be, what must be produced to ensure it, and what discarded as no longer of value. The right to well-being means the possibility of living like human beings, and of bringing up children to be members of a society better than ours, whilst the right to work only means the right to be always a wage slave, a drudge, ruled over and exploited by the middle class of the future. The right to well-being is the social revolution. The right to work means nothing but the treadmill of commercialism. It is high time for the worker to assert his right to the common inheritance, and to enter into possession of it. And all. Recording by Enco. Conquest of Bread. This is a LibraVox recording. All LibraVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit libravox.org. Recording by Enko. The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Anarchist Communism. Part 1. Every society, on abolishing private property, will be forced to be maintained to organize itself on the lines of communistic anarchy. Anarchy leads to communism, and communism to anarchy, both alike being expressions of the predominant tendency in modern societies, the pursuit of equality. Time was when a peasant family could consider the corn it sowed and reaped, or the woolen garments woven in the cottage, as the products of its own soil. But even then, this way of looking at things was not quite correct. There were the roads and the bridges made in common, the swamps drained by common toil, the communal pastures, enclosed by hedges, which were kept in repair by each and all. If the looms for weaving or the dyes for colouring fabrics were improved by somebody, all profited, and even in those days, a peasant family could not live alone, but was dependent in 1,000 ways on the village or the commune. But nowadays, in the present state of industry, when everything is interdependent, when each branch of production is knit up with all the rest, the attempt to claim an individualist origin for the products of industry is absolutely untenable. The astonishing perfection attained by the textile or mining industries in civilized countries is due to the simultaneous development of 1,000 other industries, great and small, to the extension of the railroad system, to interoceanic navigation, to the manual skill of thousands of workers, to a certain standard of culture reached by the working class as a whole, to the labours, in short, of men in every corner of the globe. The Italians who died of cholera while making the Suez Canal, or of ankylosis in the St. Gotthard Tunnel, and the Americans mowed down by shot and shell while fighting for the abolition of slavery, have helped to develop the cotton industry of France and England, as well as the work girls who languish in the factories of Manchester and Rouen, and the inventor who, open bracket, following the suggestion of some worker, close bracket, succeeds in improving the looms. How then shall we estimate the share of each in the riches which all contribute to amass? Looking at production from the general synthetic point of view, we cannot hold with the collectivists that payment proportionate to the hours of labor rendered by each would be an ideal arrangement, or even a step in the right direction, without discussing whether exchange value of goods is really measured in existing societies by the amount of work necessary to produce it, according to the teaching of Adam Smith and Ricardo, in whose steps Marx has followed. Suffice it to say here, leaving ourselves free to return to the subject later, that the collectivist ideal appears to us untenable in a society which considers the instrument of labor as a common inheritance. Starting from this principle, such a society would find itself forced from the very outset to abandon all forms of wages. The migrated individualism of a collectivist system certainly could not maintain itself alongside a partial communism, the socialization of land and the instruments of production. A new form of property requires a new form of remuneration. A new method of production cannot exist side by side with the old forms of consumption, any more than it can adapt itself to the old forms of political organization. The wage system arises out of the individual ownership of the land and the instruments of labor. It was the necessary condition for the development of capitalist production, and will perish with it in spite of the attempt to disguise it as profit sharing. The common possession of the instruments of labor must necessarily bring with it the enjoyment in common of the fruits of common labor. We hold further that communism is not only desirable, but that existing societies founded on individualism are inevitably impelled in the direction of communism. The development of individualism during the last 3 centuries is explained by the efforts of the individual to protect himself from the tyranny of capital and the state. For a time he imagined, and those who expressed his thought for him declared, that he could free himself entirely from the state and from society. By means of money, he said, I can buy all that I need, but the individual was on a wrong track, and modern history has taught him to recognize that, without the help of all, he can do nothing, although his strong boxes are full of gold. In fact, along this current of individualism, we find in all modern history a tendency, on the one hand, to return all that remains of the partial communism of antiquity, and on the other, to establish the communist principle in the 1,000 developments of modern life. As soon as the communes of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries had succeeded in emancipating themselves from their lords, ecclesiastical or lay, their communal labor and communal consumption began to extend and develop rapidly. The township and the private persons freighted ships and equipped expeditions for the export of their manufacture, and the benefit arising from the foreign trade did not accrue to individuals, but was shared by all. At the outset, the townships also bought provisions for all their citizens. Traces of these institutions have lingered on into the 19th century, and the people piously cherish the memory of them in their legends. All that has disappeared, but the rural township still struggles to preserve the lost traces of its communism, and it succeeds, except when the state throws its heavy sword into the balance, Meanwhile, new organizations, based on the same principle, to every man according to his needs, spring up under 1,000 different forms, for without a certain event of communism, the present societies could not exist. In spite of the narrowly egoistic turn given to man's mind by the commercial system, the tendency towards communism is constantly appearing, and it influences our activities in a variety of ways. The bridges for the use of which a toll was levied in the old days have become public property and are free to all, so are the high roads, except in the east, where a toll is still exacted from the traveller for every mile of his journey. Museums, free libraries, free schools, free meals for children, parks and gardens open to all, streets paved and lighted, free to all, water supplied to every house without measure or stint. All such arrangements are founded on the principle, take what you need. The tramways and railways have already introduced monthly and annual season tickets, without limiting the number of journeys taken, and two nations, Hungary and Russia, have introduced in their railways the zone system, which permits the holder to travel 500 or 800 miles for the same price. It is but a short step from that to the uniform charge, such as already prevails in the postal service. In all these innovations, and in 1,000 others, the tendency is not to measure the individual consumption. One man wants to travel 800 miles, another 500. These are personal requirements. There is no sufficient reason why one should pay twice as much as the other, because his need is twice as great. Such are the signs which appear even now in our individualist societies. Moreover, there is a tendency, though still a feeble one, to consider the needs of the individual, irrespective of his part of possible services to the community. We are beginning to think of society as a whole, each part of which is so intimately bound up with the others that a service rendered to one is a service rendered to all. When you go to a public library, not indeed the National Library of Paris, but say into the British Museum or the Berlin Library, the librarian does not ask what services you have rendered to society before giving you the book, or the 50 books which you require. He even comes to your assistance if you do not know how to manage the catalogue. By means of uniform credentials, and very often a contribution of work is preferred, the scientific society opens its museums, its gardens, its library, its laboratories, and its annual conversations to each of its members, whether he be a Darwin or a simple amateur. At St. Petersburg, if you are elaborating an invention, you go into a special laboratory, where you are given a place, a carpenter's bench, a turning lathe, all the necessary tools and scientific instruments, provided only you know how to use them, and you are allowed to work there as long as you please. There are the tools. Interest others in your idea, join with fellow workers skilled in various crafts, or work alone if you prefer it. Invent a flying machine, or invent nothing. That is your own affair. You are pursuing an idea, that is enough. In the same way, those who man the lifeboat do not ask credentials from the crew of a sinking ship. They launch their boat, risk their lives in the raging waves, and sometimes perish, all to save men whom they do not even know. And what need to know them? They are human beings, and they need our aid. That is enough. That establishes their right to the rescue. Thus we find a tendency eminently communistic, springing up on all sides and in various guises in the very heart of theoretically individualist societies. Suppose that one of our great cities, so egotistic in ordinary times, were visited tomorrow by some calamity, a siege for instance. That same selfish city would decide that the first needs to satisfy were those of the children and the aged, without asking what services they had rendered or were likely to render to society. It would first of all feed them. Then the combatants would be cared for, irrespective of the courage or the intelligence which each had displayed, and thousands of men and women would outvie each other in unselfish devotion to the wounded. This tendency exists and is felt as soon as the most pressing needs of each are satisfied, and in proportion as the productive power of a race increases. It becomes an active force every time a great idea comes to oust the mean preoccupations of everyday life. How can we doubt then that when the instruments of production are placed on the service of all, when business is conducted on communist principles, when labor, having recovered its place of honor in society, produces much more than is necessary to all, how can we doubt that this force, already so powerful, will enlarge sphere of action till it becomes the ruling principle of social life? Following these indications, and considering further the practical side of expropriation, of which we shall speak in the following chapters, we are convinced that our first obligation, when the revolution shall have broken the power upholding the present system, will be to realize communism without delay. But ours is neither the communism of Fourier and the Phalansterians, nor of the German state socialists. It is anarchist communism, communism without government, the communism of the free. It is the synthesis of the two ideas pursued by humanity throughout the ages, economic and political liberty. Part 2. In taking anarchy for our ideal of political organization, we are only giving expression to another marked tendency of human progress. Whenever European societies have developed up to a certain point, we have shaken off the yoke of authority and substituted a system founded more or less on the principles of individual liberty, and history shows us that these periods of partial or general revolution, when the old governments were overthrown, were also periods of sudden progress both in the economic and the intellectual field. So it was after the enfranchisement of the communes, whose monuments, produced by the free labor of the guilds, have never been surpassed. So it was after the Great Peasant Uprising, which brought about the Reformation and imperiled the papacy. And so it was again with a society, free for a brief space, which was created on the other side of the Atlantic by the malcontents from the old world. And if we observe the present development of civilizations, we see most unmistakably a movement ever more and more marked tending to limit the sphere of action of the government, and to allow more and more liberty to the individual. This evolution is going on before our eyes, though cumbered by the ruins and rubbish of all institutions and all superstitions. Like all evolutions, it only waits a revolution to overthrow the old obstacles which block the way, that it may find free scope in a regenerated society. After having striven long in vain to solve the insoluble problem, the problem of constructing a government which will constrain the individual to obedience without itself ceasing to be the servant of society, men at last attempt to free themselves from every form of government and to satisfy their need for organization by free contacts between individuals and groups pursuing the same aim. The independence of each small territorial unit becomes a pressing need. Mutual agreement replaces law in order to regulate individual interests in view of a common object, very often disregarding the frontiers of the present states. All that was once looked upon as a function of the government is today called in question. Things are arranged more easily and more satisfactorily without the intervention of the state, and in studying the progress made in this direction, we are led to conclude that the tendency of the human race is to reduce government interference to zero. In fact, to abolish the state, the personification of injustice, oppression and monopoly. We can already catch glimpses of a world in which the bonds which bind the individual are no longer laws, but social habits, the result of the need felt by each one of us to seek the support, the cooperation, the sympathy of his neighbors. Assuredly, the idea of a society without a state will give rise to at least as many objections as the political economy of a society without early capital. We have all been brought up from our childhood to regard the state as a sort of providence. All our education, the Roman history we learn at school, the Byzantine code which we studied later under the name of Roman law, and the various sciences taught at the universities accustom us to believe in government and in the virtues of state providential. To maintain this superstition, all systems of philosophy have been elaborated and taught. All politics are based on this principle, and each politician, whatever his colors, comes forward and says to the people, "Give my party the power, we can and we will free you from the miseries which press so heavily upon you." From the cradle to the grave, all our actions are guided by this principle. Open any book on sociology or jurisprudence, and you will find there the government, its organization, its acts, fill in so large a place that we come to believe that there is nothing outside the government and the role of statesmen. The press teaches us the same in every conceivable way. Whole columns are devoted to parliamentary debates and to political intrigues, while the vast everyday life of a nation appears only in the columns given to economic subjects, or in the pages devoted to reports of police and law cases. And when you read the newspapers, you hardly think of the incalculable number of beings, all humanity so to say, who grow up and die, in the sorrow, who work and consume, think and create outside the few encumbering personages who have been so magnified that humanity is hidden by their shadows, enlarged by our ignorance. And yet as soon as we pass from political matter to life itself, as soon as we throw a glance at society, we are struck by the infinite small part played by the government. Balzac already has remarked how millions of peasants spend the whole of their lives without knowing anything about the state, save the heavy taxes they are compelled to pay. Every day, millions of transactions are made without government intervention, and the greatest of them, those of commerce and other exchange, are carried on in such a way that the government could not be appealed to if one of the contracting parties had the intention of not fulfilling his agreement. Should you speak to a man who understands commerce, he will tell you that the everyday business transacted by merchants would be absolutely impossible were it not based on mutual confidence. The habit of keeping his word, the desire not to lose his credit, amply suffice to maintain this relative honesty. The man who does not feel the slightest remorse when poisoning his customers with noxious drugs, covered with pompous labels, think he is in honor bound to keep his engagements. But if this relative morality has developed under present conditions, when enrichment is the only incentive and the only aim, can we doubt its rapid progress when appropriation of the fruits of others' labor will no longer be the basis of society? Another striking fact, which especially characterizes our generation, speaks still more in favor of our ideas. It is the continual extension of the field of enterprise due to private initiative and the prodigious development of free organizations of all kinds. We shall discuss this more at length in the chapter devoted to free agreement. Suffice it to mention that the facts are so numerous and so customary that they are the essence of the second half of the 19th century. Even the political and socialist writers ignore them, always preferring to talk to us about the functions of the government. These organizations, free and infinitely varied, are so natural an outcome of our civilization. They expand so rapidly and federate with so much ease. They are so necessary as a result of the continual growth of the needs of civilized men,
and also they so advantageously reverse governmental interference that we must recognize in them a factor of growing importance in the life of societies. If they do not yet spread over the whole of the manifestations of life, it is that they find an insurmountable obstacle in the poverty of the worker, of the divisions of present society, in the private appropriation of capital, and in the state. Abolish these obstacles, and we will see them to govern the immense field of civilized man's activity. The history of the last 50 years furnishes a living proof that representative government is impotent to discharge all the functions we have sought to assign to it. In days to come, the 19th century will be quoted as having witnessed a failure of parliamentarianism. This impotence is becoming so evident to all. The faults of parliamentarianism and the inherent vices of a representative principle are so self-evident that the few thinkers who have made a critical study of them, G.S. Mill, Leverdays, did but give literary form to the popular dissatisfaction. It is not difficult indeed to see the absurdity of naming a few men and saying to them, make laws regulating all our spheres of activity, although not one of you knows anything about them. We are beginning to see that government by majorities means abandoning all the affairs of the country to the tide waiters who make up the majorities in the House and in election committees, to those, in a word, who have no opinion of their own. Mankind is seeking and already finding new issues. The International Postal Union, the railway unions, and the loan societies give us examples of solutions based on free agreement in place instead of law. Today, when groups scattered far and wide wish to organize themselves for some object or other, they no longer elect an international parliament that objects on all trades. They proceed in a different way, where it is not possible to meet directly or come to an agreement by correspondence. Delegates versed in the question at issue are sent, and they are told, and they have to come to an agreement on such or such a question, and then return, not with a law in the pocket, but with a proposition of agreement which we may or may not accept. Such is the method of the great industrial companies, the learned societies, and numerous associations of every description, which already cover Europe and the United States. And such will be the method of a free society. A society founded on subjectism keeping absolute monarchy. A society based on a rich system and the exploitation of the masses by the capitalist find its political expression in parliamentarianism. But a free society beginning possession of a common inheritance must seek in free groups and free federations of groups a new organization in harmony with the new economic phase of history. Every economic phase has a political phase corresponding to it, and it will be impossible to touch private property unless a new mode of political life be found at the same time. End of recording by Anchor.
Reputations are well earned. These void shards are dropping like flies.
First of break. This is a LibraVox recording. All LibraVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit libravox.org. Recording by Anchor. The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Expropriation. Part 1. It is told of Rothschild that seeing his fortune threatened by the revolution of 1848, he hit upon the following stratagem. I am quite willing to admit, said he, that my fortune has been accumulated at the expense of others. But if it were divided tomorrow among the millions of Europe, the share of each would only amount to 4 shillings. Very well then, I undertake to render to each his 4 shillings, if he asks me for it. Having given due publicity to his promise, our millionaire proceeded as usual to stroll quietly through the streets of Frankfurt. 3 or 4 persons-by asked for their 4 shillings, which he disbursed with a sardonic smile. His stratagem succeeded, and the family of the millionaire is still in possession of its wealth. It is in much the same fashion that the shrewd heads among the middle classes reason when they say, "Ah, expropriation. I know what that means. You take all the overcoats and lay them in a heap, and everyone is free to help himself and fight for the best." But such jests are irrelevant as well as flippant. What we want is not a redistribution of the goods, although it must be said that even in such a case, the shivering folk would see advantage in it, nor do we want to divide up the wealth of the Rothschilds. What we do want is so to arrange things that every human being born into the world shall be ensured the opportunity in the first sense of learning some useful occupation and of becoming skilled in it, and next that he shall be free to work at his trade without asking leave of master or owner, and without handing over to landlord or capitalist the lion's share of what he produces. As to the wealth held by the Rothschilds or the Vanderbilt, it will serve us to organize our system of communal production. The day when the laborer may till the ground without paying away half of what he produces, the day when the machines necessary to prepare the soil for a rich harvest are at the free disposal of the cultivators, the day when the worker in the factory produces for the community and not for a monopolist, that day will see the workers clothed and fed, and there will be no more Rothschilds or other exploiters. No one will then have to sell his working power for a wage that only represents a fraction of what he produces. So far so good, say our critics, but you will have Rothschilds coming in from the outside. How are you to prevent a person from amassing millions in China and then settling amongst you? How are you going to prevent such a one from surrounding himself with lackeys and wage slaves, from exploiting them and enriching himself at their expense? You cannot bring about a revolution all over the world at the same time. Well then, are you going to establish custom houses on your frontiers, to search all who enter your country and confiscate the money they bring with them? Anarchist policemen firing on travelers would be a fine spectacle. But at the root of this argument there is a great error.
Those who propound it have never paused to inquire whence come the fortunes of the rich. A little thought would, however, suffice to show them that these fortunes have their beginnings in the poverty of the poor. When there are no longer any destitute, there will no longer be any rich to exploit them. Let us glance for a moment at the Middle Ages, when great fortunes began to spring up. A feudal baron seizes on a fertile valley, but as long as the fertile valley is empty of folk, our baron is not rich. His land brings him in nothing. He might as well possess a property in the moon. What does our baron do to enrich himself? He looks out for peasants, for poor peasants. If every peasant farmer had a piece of land, free from rent and taxes, if he had in addition the tools and the stock necessary for farm labor, who would plough the lands of the baron? Everyone will look after his own. But there are thousands of destitute persons ruined by wars, or drought, or pestilence. They have neither horse nor plough. Iron was very costly in the Middle Ages, and a drought was still more so. All these destitute creatures are trying to better their condition. One day they see on the road at the confines of our barren state a notice board indicating by certain signs, adapted to their comprehension, that the laborer who is willing to settle on his estate will receive the tools and materials to build his cottage into his fields, and a portion of land rent free for a certain number of years. The number of years is represented by so many crosses on the signboard, and the peasant understands the meaning of these crosses. So the poor wretches come to settle on the barren land. They make roads, drain the marshes, build villages. In 9 or 10 years, the baron begins to tax them. 5 years later, he increases the rent. Then he doubles it, and the peasants accept these new conditions because he cannot find better ones elsewhere. Little by little, with the aid of laws made by the barons, the property of the peasant becomes the source of the landlord's wealth. And it is not only the load of the manor who grows upon him. A whole host of usurers swoop down upon the villages, multiplying as the righteousness of the peasants increases. That is how these things happen in the Middle Ages. And today, is it not still the same thing? If there were free land which the peasant could cultivate if he pleased, would he pay £50 to some shable of a duke? Open footnote. Shable of a duke is an expression coined by Carlyle. It is a somewhat free rendering of Kropotkin's Monsieur le Vicomte, but I think it expresses his meaning. Translator. Close footnote. For condescending to sell him his crop, would he burden himself with a lease which absorb a third of the produce? Would he, under métayer system, consent to give half of his harvest to the landowner? But he has nothing, so he will accept any conditions, if only he can keep body and soul together, while he tills the soil and enriches the landlord. So in the 19th century, just as in the Middle Ages, the poverty of a peasant is a source of wealth to the landed proprietor. Part 2. The landlord owes his riches to the poverty of the peasants, and the wealth of the capitalist comes from the same source. Take the case of a citizen of the middle class, who somehow or other finds himself in possession of £20,000. He could of course spend his money at the rate of £2,000 a year, a mere bagatelle in these days of fantastic senseless luxury. But then he would have nothing left at the end of 10 years. So being a practical person, he prefers to keep his fortune intact, and win for himself a snug little annual income as well. This is very easy in our society, for the good reason that the towns and villages swarm with workers who have not the wherewithal to live for a month, or even a fortnight. So our worthy citizen starts a factory. The banks hasten to lend him another £20,000, especially if he has a reputation for business ability. And with this round sum, he can command the labor of 500 hands. If all the men and women in the countryside had their daily bread assured, and their daily needs already satisfied, who would work for our capitalists at a wage of half a crown a day, while the commodities one produces in a day sell in the market for a crown or more? Unhappily, we know it all too well. The poor quarters of our towns and the neighboring villages are full of needy wretches whose children clamour for bread. So before the factory is well finished, the workers hasten to offer themselves. Where 100 are required, 300 besiege the doors. And from the time his mill is started, the owner, if he only has average business capacities, will clear £40 a year out of each mill hand he employs. He is thus able to live by his snug little fortune, and if he chooses a lucrative trade and has business talents, he will soon increase his income by doubling the number of men he exploits. So he becomes a personage of importance. He can afford to give dinners to other personages, the local magnates, the civic, legal and political dignitaries. With his money he can marry money. By and by he may pick and choose places for his children, and later on perhaps get something good from the government, a contract for the army or for the police. His gold breeds gold, till at last a war, or even a rumor of war, or a speculation on the stock exchange, gives him his great opportunity. 9/10 of the great fortunes made in the United States are, as Henry George has shown in his Social Problems, the result of knavery on a large scale, assisted by the state. In Europe, 9/10 of the fortunes made in our monarchies and republics have the same origin. There are not two ways of becoming a millionaire. This is the secret of wealth. Find the starving and destitute, pay them half a crown, and make them produce 5 shillings worth in the day. Amass a fortune by these means, and then increase it by some lucky speculation, made with the help of the state. Need we go on to speak of small fortunes, attributed by the economists to forethought and frugality, when we know that mere saving in itself brings in nothing, so long as the pence saved are not used to exploit the famishing? Take a shoemaker for instance. Grant that his work is well paid, that he has plenty of custom, and that by dint of strict frugality he contrives to lay by from 18
Yo,
pence to 3
Bob, I
shillings a day,
didn't
perhaps
notice
£2 a month.
too.
Grant that our shoemaker is never ill,
I feel
that he does
bad
not half
now.
starve himself, in spite of his passion for economy, that he doesn't marry or that he has no children, that he does not die of consumption. Suppose anything and everything you please. Well, at the age of 50, he will not have scrapped together £800, and he will not have enough to live on during his old age, when he is past work. Assuredly, this is not how fortunes are made. But suppose our shoemaker, as soon as he has laid by a few pence, thriftily conveys them to the savings bank, and that the savings bank lends them to the capitalist who is just about to employ labor, that is, to exploit the poor. Then our shoemaker takes an apprentice, the child of some poor wretch, who will think himself lucky if in 5 years' time his son has learned the trade and is able to earn his living. Meanwhile, our shoemaker does not lose by him, and if trade is brisk, he soon takes a second, and then a third apprentice. By and by he will take 2 or 3 working men, poor wretches, thankful to receive half a crown a day for work that is worth 5 shillings. And if our shoemaker is in luck, that is to say, if he is keen enough and mean enough, his working men and apprentices will bring him in nearly £1 a day over and above the product of his own toil. He can then enlarge his business. He will gradually become rich, and no longer have any need to stint himself in the necessaries of life. He will leave a snug little fortune to his son. That is what people call being economical and having frugal temperate habits. At bottom it is nothing more nor less than grinding the face of the poor. Commerce seems an exception to this rule. Such a man, we are told, buys tea in China, brings it to France, and realizes a profit of 30% on his original outlay. He has exploited nobody. Nevertheless, the case is quite similar. If our merchant had carried his beers on his back, well and good. In early medieval times, that was exactly how foreign trade was conducted, and so no one reached such giddy heights of fortune as in our days. Very few and very hardly earned were the gold coins which the medieval merchant gained from a long and dangerous voyage. It was less the love of money than the thirst of travel and adventure that inspired his undertakings. Nowadays, the method is simpler. A merchant who has some capital need not tire from his desk to become wealthy. He telegraphs to an agent telling him to buy 100 tons of tea. He freights a ship, and in a few weeks, in 3 months, if it is a sailing ship, the vessel brings him his cargo. He does not even take the risk of the voyage, for his tea and his vessel are insured, and if he has expended £4,000, he will receive more than 5 or 6,000. That is to say, if he has not attempted to speculate in some novel commodities, in which case he runs a chance of either doubling his fortune or losing it altogether. Now, how could he find men willing to cross the sea, to travel to China and back, to endure hardship and slavish toil, and to risk their lives for a miserable pittance? How could he find dock laborers willing to load and unload his ships for starvation wages? How? Because they are needy and starving. Go to the seaports, visit the cookshops and taverns and the quays, and look at these men who have come to hire themselves, crowding round the dock gates which they besiege from early dawn, hoping to be allowed to work on the vessels. Look at these sailors, happy to be hired for a long voyage. After weeks and months of waiting, all their lives long, they have gone to the sea in ships, and they will sail in others still, until they have perished in the waves. Enter their homes, look at their wives and children in rags, even one knows not how till the father's return, and you will have the answer to the question. Multiply examples. Choose one where you will. Consider the origin of all fortunes, large or small, whether arising out of commerce, finance, manufacturers, or the land. Everywhere you will find that the wealth of the wealthy springs from the poverty of the poor. This is why an anarchist society need not fear the advent of a Rothschild, who would settle in its midst. If every member of a community knows that after a few hours of productive toil, he will have a right to all the pleasures that civilization offers, and to those deeper sources of enjoyment which all the silence of the people who seek them, he will not sell his strength for a starvation wage. No one will volunteer to work for the enrichment of the Rothschild. His golden guineas will be only so many pieces of metal, useful for various purposes, but incapable of breeding more. In answering the above objections, we have at the same time indicated the scope of expropriation. It must apply to everything that enables any man, be he financier, mill owner or landlord, to appropriate the products of others' toil. Our formula is simple and comprehensive. We do not want to rob anyone of his coat, but we wish to give to the workers all those things the lack of which makes them full and easy prey to the exploiter. And we will do our utmost that none shall lack aught, that not a single man shall be forced to sell the strength of his right arm to obtain a close subsistence for himself and his babes. This is what we mean when we talk of expropriation. This will be our duty during the revolution, the whose coming will be 200 years hence, but soon, very soon. Part 3. The ideas of anarchism in general, and of expropriation in particular, are not unsympathetic when we are apt to imagine among men of independent character, and those for whom idleness is not the supreme ideal. Still, our friends often warn us, take care you do not go too far. Humanity cannot be changed in a day, so do not be in too great a hurry with your schemes of expropriation and anarchy, or you will be in danger of achieving no permanent result. Now, what we fear with regard to expropriation is exactly the contrary. We are afraid of not going far enough, of carrying out expropriation on too small a scale to be lasting. We would not have the revolutionary impulse Aristotelian career to exhaust itself in half measures, which would content no one, and while producing a tremendous confusion in society and stopping its customary activities, would have no vital power, would merely spread general discontent and inevitably prepare the way for the triumph of reaction. There are in fact in a modern state establish relations which it is practically impossible to modify if one attacks them only in detail. They are always within wheels in our economic organization. The machinery is so complex and interdependent that no one part can be modified without disturbing the whole. This becomes clear as soon as an attempt is made to expropriate anything. Let us suppose that in a certain country, a limited form of expropriation is effected. For example, by having factories invested more than once, only the property of the great landlords is socialized, while the factories are left untouched, or that in a certain system, house property is taken over by the commune, but everything else is left to private ownership, or that in some manufacturing center, the factories are communalized, but the land is left unsecured. The same result would follow in each case, a terrible shattering of the industrial system. Without the means of reorganizing it and new land, industry and finance would be at a deadlock, yet a return to the first principles of justice would not have been achieved, and society would find itself powerless to accept the former reform. If agriculture were freed from great landowners, while industry still remained the bond slave of the capitalist, the merchant and the banker, nothing would be accomplished. The peasant suffers today not only in having to pay rent to the landlord, he is oppressed on all hands by existing conditions. He is exploited by the tradesman, who makes him pay half a crown for a spade which, measured by the labour spent on it, is not worth more than sixpence. He is taxed by the state, which cannot be revived from without hierarchy of officials, and finds it necessary to maintain an expensive army, because the traders of all nations are perpetually fighting for the markets, and any day a little quarrel arising from the exploitation of some part of Asia or Africa may result in war. Then again, the peasant suffers from the depopulation of country places. The young people are attracted to the large manufacturing towns by the bait of high wages paid temporarily by the producers of articles of luxury, or by the attractions of a most tiring life. The artificial protection of industry, the industrial exploitation of foreign countries, the prevalence of stock jobbing, the difficulty of improving the soil, and the machinery of production, all these agencies combine nowadays to work against agriculture, which is burdened not only by rent, but by the whole complex of conditions in a society based on exploitation. Thus, even if the expropriation of land were accomplished, and everyone were free to till the soil and cultivate it to the best advantage without paying rent, agriculture, even though it should enjoy, which can by no means be taken for granted, a momentary prosperity, would soon fall back into the slough in which it finds itself today. The whole thing would have to be begun over again, with increased difficulties. The same holds true of industry. Take the converse case. Instead of turning the agricultural laborers into peasant proprietors, make over the factories to those who work in them. Abolish the master manufacturers, but leave the landlord his land, the banker his money, the merchant his exchange. Maintain the swarm of idlers who live on the toil of the workmen, the 1,001 middlemen, the state with its numberless officials, and industry will come to standstill, finding new purchasers in the master peasant who would remain full, not possessing the raw material and unable to export their produce, partly on account of the stoppage of trade, and still more so because industry spread all over the world. The manufacturers would be unable to struggle, and thousands of workers would be stored up in the streets. These starving crowds would be ready and willing to submit to the first schemer who came to exploit them. They would even consent to return to the old slavery, and the promise of guaranteed work, or finally suppose to oust the landowners and hand over the mills and factories to the worker, without interfering with a swarm of middlemen who train the product of our manufacturers and speculate in corn and flour, meat and groceries in our great centers of commerce. Then as soon as the exchange of produce is slackened, as soon as the great cities are left without bread, while the great manufacturing centers find no buyers for the articles of luxury they produce, the counter-revolution is bound to take place, and it would come trading upon the slain, sweeping the towns and villages with shot and shell, indulging in orgies of proscriptions and deportations, such as was seen in France in 1815, 1848 and 1871. All is interdependent in a civilized country. It is impossible to reform any one thing without altering the whole. Therefore, on the day a nation will strike at private property under any one of its forms, territorial or industrial, it will be obliged to attack them all. The very success of the revolution will impose it. Besides, even if it were desired, it would be impossible to confine the change to a partial expropriation. Once the principle of the divine right of property is shaken, no amount of theorizing will prevent its overthrow. Hereby the slaves of the field, thereby the slaves of the machine. If a great town, Paris for example, were to confine itself to taking possession of the dwelling houses of the factories, it would be forced also to deny the right of the bankers to levy upon the commune tax amounting to £2 million in the form of interest for former loans. The great city would be obliged to put itself in touch with the rural districts, and its influence would inevitably urge the peasants to free themselves from the landowner. It would be necessary to communalize the railways, that the citizens might get food and work, and lawsuits to prevent the waste of supplies, and to guard against the trust of the court speculators, like those to whom the Paris Commune of 1793 fell a prey. It would have to place in the hands of the city the work of stocking its warehouses with commodities and apportioning the produce. Some socialists still seek, however, to establish a distinction. Of course, they say the soil, the mines, the mills and manufacturers must be expropriated. These are the instruments of production, and it is right we should consider them public property. But articles of consumption, food, clothes and dwellings, should remain private property. Popular common sense has got the better of this subtle distinction. We are not savages who can live in the woods, without the shelter of the ranges. The civilized man needs a roof, a house and a bed. It is true that the bed, the room and the house is a home of idleness for government producer, but for the worker a room properly heated and lighted is as much an instrument of production as the tool or the machine. It is the place where the nerves and sinews gather strength. For the worker the morals, the rest of the workman is the daily repairing of the machine. The same argument applies even more obviously to food. The so-called economists who make the just mentioned distinction would hardly deny that the coal burnt in the machine is as necessary to production as the raw material itself. How then can food, without which the human machine could do no work, be excluded from the list of things indispensable to the producer? Can this be a relic of religious metaphysics? The rich man's feast is indeed a matter of luxury, but the food of the worker is just as much a part of production as the fuel burnt by the steam engine. The same with clothing. We are not New Guinea savages, and if the dainty gowns of our ladies must rank as objects of luxury, there is nevertheless a certain quantity of linen, cotton and woolen stuff which is a necessity of life to the producer. The shirts and trousers in which he goes to his work, the jacket he slips on after the day's toil is over, are as necessary to him as the hammer to the anvil. Whether we like it or not, this is what the people mean by a revolution. As soon as they have made a clean sweep of the government, they will seek first of all to ensure to themselves decent dwellings and sufficient food and clothes, free of capitalist rent. And the people will be right. The methods of the people will be much more in accordance with science than those of the economists who draw so many distinctions between instruments of production and articles of consumption. The people understand that this is just the point where the revolution ought to begin, and they will lay the foundations of the only economic science worthy the name, a science which might be called the study of the needs of humanity and of the economic means to satisfy them, and of its population. Reporting by people. Quest for bread. This is a LibraVox recording. All LibraVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit libravox.org. Recording by Enko. The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Food Part 1. If the coming revolution is to be a social revolution, it will be distinguished from all former uprisings, not only by its name, but also by its methods. To attain a new end, new means are required. The three great popular movements, which we have seen in France during the last 100 years, differ from each other in many ways, but they have one common feature. In each case, the people strove to overturn the old regime and spent their heart's blood for the cause. When, after having borne the brunt of the battle, they sank again into obscurity, a government composed of men more or less honest was formed and undertook to organize a new regime. The Republic in 1793, Labour in 1848, the Free Commune in 1871. Imbued with Jacobin ideas, this government occupied itself first of all with political questions, such as the reorganization of the machinery of government, the clarifying of the administration, the stabilizing of the state, liberty in such matters. It is true the workmen were kept an eye on the members of the new government, and often imposed their ideas on them. But even in these clubs, whether the leaders belonged to the middle or the working classes, it was always middle-class ideas which prevailed. They discussed various political questions with great length, but forgot to discuss the question of God. Great ideas sprang up at such times, ideas that have moved the world. Words were spoken which still stir our hearts at the interval of more than a century, but the people were starving in the slums. From the very commencement of the revolution, industry inevitably came to a stop. The circulation of produce was checked, and capital concealed itself. The master, the employer, had nothing to fear at such times. He fattened on his dividends, if indeed he did not speculate under wretchedness around, but the wage earner was reduced to live from hand to mouth. Want knocked at the door. Famine was abroad in the land, such famine as had hardly been seen under the old regime. The Girondists or starving us was the cry in the worksmen quarters in 1793, and thereupon the Girondists were guillotined, and full powers were given to the mountain and to the commune. The commune indeed concerned itself with the question of bread, and made heroic efforts to feed Paris. At Lyon, Fouché and Collot d'Herbois established city granaries, but the sums spent on filling them were woefully insufficient. The town councils made great efforts to procure corn, the bakers who hoarded flour were hanged, and still the people lacked bread. Then they turned on the royalist conspirators and laid the blame at their door. They guillotined a dozen or 15 a day. Servants and duchesses alike, especially servants, for the duchesses had gone to Coblentz, but if they had guillotined 100 dukes and viscounts every day, it would have been equally hopeless. The want only grew, for the wage earner cannot live without his wage, and the wage was not forthcoming. What difference could 1,000 corpses more or less make to him? Then the people began to grow weary. So much for your vaunted revolution. You are more wretched than ever before, whispered the reactionary in the ears of the worker, and little by little the rich took courage, emerged from behind deserts, and flaunted their luxury in the face of a starving multitude. They dressed up like scented fox and said to the workers, "Come, enough of this foolery. What have you gained by your revolution?" And sick at heart, his patience at an end, the revolutionary had at last to admit to himself that the cause was lost once more. He retreated into his hovel and awaited the worst.
Then reaction probably asserted itself and accomplished a counter-revolutionary stroke, a revolution that nothing remained but to trample its corpse underfoot. The White Terror began. Blood flowed like water. The guillotine was never idle. The prisons were crowded, while the pageant of rank and fashion resumed its old course and went on as merrily as before. This picture is typical of all our revolutions. In 1848, the workers of Paris placed 3 months of starvation at the service of the Republic, and then, having reached the limit of their powers, they made in June one last desperate effort, an effort which was drowned in blood. In 1871, the Commune perished for lack of combatants. It had taken measures for the separation of church and state, but it neglected, alas until to date, to take measures for providing the people with bread, and so it came to pass in Paris that elegant and fine gentlemen could spurn the Confederates and bid them go sell their rights for miserable pittance, and leave their betters to feast at their ease in fashionable restaurants. Of course, the Commune saw its mistake and opened communal kitchens, but it was too late. Its days were already numbered, and the troops of Versailles were on the ramparts. Bread, it is bread that the revolution needs. Let others spend their time in issuing pompous proclamations, in decorating themselves lavishly with official gold lace, and in talking about political liberty. Be it ours to see, from the first day of the revolution to the last, in all the provinces fighting for freedom, that there is not a single man who lacks bread, not a single woman compelled to stand with a wearied crowd outside the bakehouse door, but happily a coarse loaf may be thrown to her in charity, not a single child pining for want of food. It has always been the middle class idea to harangue about great principles, great lies rather. The idea of the people will be to provide bread for all, and while middle-class citizens and workmen infested with middle-class ideas admire their own rhetoric in the talking shops, and practical people are engaged in endless discussions on forms of government, we, the utopian dreamers, we shall have to consider the question of daily bread. We have the temerity to declare that all have a right to bread, that there is bread enough for all, and that with this watchword of bread for all, the revolution will triumph. Part 2. That we are utopians is well known. So utopian are we that we go the length of believing that the revolution can and ought to assure shelter, food and clothes to all, an idea extremely displeasing to middle-class citizens, whatever their particular, for they are quite alive to the fact that it is not easy to keep the upper hand of a people whose hunger is satisfied. All the same we maintain our contention. Bread must be found for the people of the revolution, and the question of bread must take precedence of all other questions. If it is settled in the interest of the people, the revolution will be on the right road, for in solving the question of bread, we must accept the principle of equality, which will force itself upon us to the exclusion of every other solution. It is certain that the coming revolution, like in that respect to the revolution of 1848, will burst upon us in the middle of a great industrial crisis. Things have been sifting for half a century now, and can only go from bad to worse. Everything tends that way. New nations entering the list of international